"If you miss rent one more time, I will have to replace you," my landlord said, standing in the hallway with his arms crossed like he had already decided who I was. I just nodded and looked past him like the words did not land, but they did. They always do. The thing is, he was not wrong, at least not on the surface. I was 45, living in a 700 square foot apartment on the second floor of a building that smelled like old paint and cheap cleaner, working 10-hour shifts at a warehouse outside Columbus, then driving food deliveries at night until my eyes burned from the road lights. I paid my rent in pieces, sometimes on the first, sometimes a few days after, sometimes with a late fee. I pretended not to notice, but I always noticed. I noticed how he talked slower to me, like I needed help understanding. I noticed how he never fixed the heater unless I asked twice. I noticed the way he looked at me, like I was temporary, like I was passing through my own life and would never really land anywhere. And maybe for a long time I believed that too. I used quarters to do my laundry, counted every dollar before buying groceries, skipped takeout even when I was exhausted, because $15 felt like a mistake I could not afford after my divorce 3 years ago. Everything had reset, my savings gone, my credit a mess, my confidence somewhere I could not reach anymore. I had spent years building a life that collapsed quietly and left me standing in the middle of it, trying to look like I still had control, and from the outside, I probably looked like someone who was barely holding it together, someone who would always be a renter, someone who would always be late, someone who would never quite catch up. But what he did not see, what no one saw, was that I had stopped trying to look like I was ahead. I had started trying to understand why I was behind. I worked during the day, listened to finance podcasts on my breaks, watched videos about credit and real estate late at night while eating whatever I had left in the fridge. I stopped buying things I did not need, stopped explaining myself to people who were not asking out of care, and started paying attention to numbers, to patterns, to small opportunities most people ignore. I did not tell anyone because it did not look like success. It looked like sacrifice. It looked like saying no over and over again. It looked like staying quiet when people assumed I was stuck. The night he warned me about rent, I went back inside, sat at my small kitchen table, and opened my laptop the same way I had every night for months, scrolling, reading, learning, building something no one could see yet, because progress at this stage does not make noise. It barely leaves a trace, but it moves, and I kept moving slowly, quietly, consistently, and 2 months later I would stand in a room I never imagined being in, wearing the same worn jacket, holding the same calm expression, while a lawyer looked up from a stack of papers, paused for just a second, and said my name. I started noticing things most people would ignore, small details that did not look important at first, like the way the building lights in the hallway stayed off longer each week, or how the maintenance requests from other tenants piled up without answers, or how the landlord stopped making eye contact unless he had to. It was subtle, but it was there. Something was shifting, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. I paid attention to the mailboxes. One afternoon when I got home later than usual, there were official-looking envelopes with printed labels, not handwritten, not casual, and I recognized the type because I had spent nights reading about it. Foreclosure notices, legal warnings, documents that did not arrive unless something was already going wrong. I did not open anything that was not mine, but I did not need to. The pattern was clear. The building was under pressure, and that changed everything, because for the first time I was not just a tenant in this place, I was someone watching the system from the inside. I went back to my apartment, sat down, and opened my laptop again, searching for terms I had only half understood before. Property liens, distressed assets, auction timelines. I read slowly, making sure I actually understood, not just pretending like I used to when things felt too complicated. I learned that buildings like this did not just fail overnight. They weakened over time. Payments, missed repairs, delayed tenants, leaving income shrinking until something finally gave. And when it did, the property did not disappear. It transferred to someone else, someone prepared, someone paying attention. I looked around my apartment, at the worn carpet, at the small kitchen, at the window that barely sealed in the winter, and for the first time I did not feel stuck there. I felt positioned, like I had been placed exactly where I needed to be, to see something early before everyone else noticed it. I started tracking everything quietly: how many units were empty, how long it took for repairs to be addressed, which bills seemed overdue based on the letters that kept appearing downstairs. It was not dramatic, it was slow and steady, like putting together a puzzle without the picture on the box. During the day, I worked like usual, lifting boxes, scanning inventory, staying focused during long shifts that left my shoulders tight and my hands sore. At night, I drove deliveries, listening to more information about financing options, about government-backed loans, about ways people without perfect credit still managed to buy property if they were disciplined enough to prepare for it. I checked my credit score every week, not because it changed much at first, but because it reminded me that I was building something even if it moved slower than I wanted. I cut expenses even further. No streaming services, no new clothes, no unnecessary driving. Everything had a purpose. Every dollar had direction. I stopped talking about my situation entirely. No explanations, no complaints, no sharing plans, because most people do not understand something until it is already finished, and I was still in the part that looks like nothing is happening, but something was happening inside my head, inside my habits, inside the way I saw time. I was no longer thinking about making it to next month. I was thinking about positioning myself for the moment when something opened and I would be ready for it, and every small decision I made from that point on was tied to that one idea. I am not here to survive, I am here to prepare. I stopped seeing the building as just a place to sleep and started seeing it as a system that could be understood and maybe even entered if I was ready for it. The letters in the mailbox kept coming, more official each time, thicker envelopes with tighter language, and one afternoon I saw something that confirmed everything. A notice taped near the entrance, not loud, not dramatic, just a clean sheet of paper with small print about financial proceedings and a date that was coming sooner than most people realized. I stood there for a few seconds reading every line slowly, making sure I did not misunderstand, because this was not something I could afford to get wrong. This was the kind of moment that either passed quietly or changed everything depending on who noticed it. Early enough, I went back upstairs, closed the door, and sat down without turning on the television, without checking my phone, just thinking through what I had learned over the past months, connecting each piece carefully. Foreclosure timelines, public records auction processes, financing options. I opened my laptop and searched for the county records, found the listing, and there it was, the building, the same address, the same worn exterior, the same place where I had been paying rent was now part of a process that would transfer ownership to someone else. The number attached to it was lower than I expected. Not cheap, not easy, but not impossible either. Not if I stayed disciplined, not if I moved carefully. I ran the numbers again and again, calculating what I had saved, what I could borrow, what kind of loan I might qualify for based on my current credit and income. It was not perfect, but it was no longer broken either. The work I had been doing quietly was starting to show up in real numbers, not just ideas, not just hope, but actual possibility. I sat there longer than I needed to, not because I was confused, but because I understood exactly what this meant. If I stepped into this, I would not be stepping into comfort, I would be stepping into responsibility, risk, pressure, decisions that would follow me for years. But if I did not step into it, I would stay exactly where I had been for too long, waiting, paying, watching someone else own the structure of my life. I looked around the apartment again, the same walls, the same small kitchen, the same window, but everything felt different because this time I was not looking at it as a tenant. I was looking at it as someone who might have a chance to change the role entirely. I did not celebrate. I did not tell anyone. I went to work the next morning, like always, lifting boxes, scanning items, staying focused. But something had shifted inside me. Every movement felt more intentional. Every hour had weight because I knew I was moving toward a decision that would define the next part of my life. After my shift, I drove deliveries again, listening to information about loan approvals, documentation requirements, timelines, closing costs. I memorized what I needed to prepare, what I needed to avoid, what mistakes people made when they rushed into something like this. I refused to rush. I had spent too long being unprepared to waste this moment by acting too quickly. At night, I gathered my documents, organized my finances, checked my credit again, and saw the numbers holding steady, not perfect, but strong enough to move forward. If everything aligned, I slept less, but not from stress, from focus. Because when you finally see a path that makes sense, your mind does not want to drift anymore. It wants to stay locked in and follow it step by step until something real stands in front of you. And for the first time in years, I could see something real forming just ahead, not guaranteed, not easy, but possible, and that was enough to keep going. I moved carefully after that night, not fast, not loud, just precise, every step planned. Before I took it, I started by calling a local credit union during my lunch break, stepping outside the warehouse where the noise of forklifts and scanners faded, just enough for me to hear clearly. I spoke slowly, making sure I understood every word. They explained about loan options, about minimum down payments, about what they would need to see from me, not just income, but consistency, not just savings, but discipline. I wrote everything down on a small notepad I kept in my jacket pocket, not because I would forget, but because writing it made it real. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table again, papers spread out in front of me, Bank statements, pay stubs, credit reports, everything I had built quietly now had to stand up to a process that did not care about effort, only about numbers and structure. I checked everything twice, making sure there were no mistakes, no missing pieces, because I knew one small error could slow everything down or even close the door completely, and I did not come this far to lose on something careless. The following days blurred into a routine that felt sharper than anything before: work during the day, deliveries at night, and in between, calls, emails, forms, applications, each one moving me closer to something that still felt unreal, but was becoming more solid with every step. I avoided conversations with neighbors in the building, not because I had anything against them, but because I could feel the difference now. They were still talking about rent increases, broken appliances, management problems, and I understood that world too well, but I was no longer only inside it. I was looking at it from a different angle, and that required silence, focus, and patience. One evening, as I walked up the stairs, I heard my landlord talking on the phone near the entrance, his voice lower than usual, more controlled, but there was tension in it, the kind that does not come from small problems. I did not stop. I did not listen longer than necessary, but I did not need to. The pieces were already clear in my mind. Everything was moving toward a point, and I was moving with it, not ahead, not behind, just in position. I received an email a few days later from the lender asking for additional documentation. Nothing unusual, just another step, but when I saw it, my hands paused for a moment, not out of fear, but out of recognition. This was the part where things became official, where intentions turned into action. I sent everything they asked for the same night, no delay, no hesitation, and then I waited, not passively, but actively, checking updates, reviewing numbers, preparing for the next requirement, because waiting in this process is not about doing nothing, it is about staying ready for the moment something shifts. I slept a little less, ate even simpler meals, kept my expenses as tight as possible, because now every dollar mattered. Not just for survival, but for entry into something bigger than I had ever been part of before, and through all of it I stayed quiet, no announcements, no explanations, because the truth is most people only understand results, they do not see preparation, they do not respect it until it turns into something visible. And I was not doing this for recognition, I was doing it because for the first time in years I could see a path that did not end where I started, and I was not going to let that disappear. I received the email late in the evening, just after finishing a delivery. The subject line was simple: request for final review, but I knew what it meant. It meant everything had moved past the early checks, past the basic approvals, and into the stage where decisions were no longer theoretical, they were real. I sat in my car for a minute with the engine off, letting the silence settle, because I understood that from this point forward there was no going back to the version of my life where I only reacted to things. Now I was stepping into a position where I would have to decide and carry the outcome of those decisions fully. I went inside, placed my keys on the table, and opened the laptop again. The same table where I had spent so many nights learning quietly now felt different, not because the room had changed, but because the lender had reviewed everything: my income, my credit, my savings, my consistency. They asked a few final questions about the property, about my plan, about how I intended to manage it, and I answered carefully, not trying to impress them, just showing that I understood what I was stepping into, that I was not guessing, that I had taken the time to prepare. Each response came from something I had already studied, already calculated, already accepted. The risks were still there, they had not disappeared, but they were no longer unknown, and that made them manageable. A few days passed without updates, which is normal in a process like this, but it did not feel normal when you are waiting for something that could change your entire direction. I stayed focused on my routine work during the day, deliveries at night, checking my phone only when I had a moment, but not letting it control me, because I knew that rushing the process would not make it move faster, it would only make me lose clarity. Then one afternoon during my shift, my phone buzzed with a new message from the lender. I stepped aside near the loading dock where the noise softened just enough to hear clearly. The message was short: approval pending, final confirmation and documentation. That was it. No celebration, no dramatic language, just a simple line that carried more weight than anything I had read in years. I stood there for a moment, reading it again, not because I doubted it, but because I wanted to understand it completely. This was not a finish line, it was a door opening, and I still had to walk through it correctly. I finished my shift without saying anything to anyone, the same routine, the same pace. But inside, everything had shifted into a sharper focus. Every step now had a direction, every decision had a consequence. I went home that night and reviewed everything again. Numbers, timelines, responsibilities, because once this moved forward, I would not just be responsible for myself anymore, I would be responsible for the structure, the payments, the people living inside it, the same people I had stood next to in the hallway without speaking much. The same building I had once felt stuck in would now become something I had to manage, maintain, and improve. I did not feel fear the way I expected. Instead, I felt weight, a steady, controlled weight that came from understanding what was ahead and accepting it fully. I looked around the apartment one more time, not with frustration, not with disappointment, but with clarity. This place had been a starting point even when I did not realize it, and now it was about to become something else. Entirely, not because of luck, not because of timing alone, but because I had stayed long enough to see the shift and prepared myself to step into it when it came. I received the final call 2 days later while I was sitting in my car outside the grocery store parking lot, the kind of place where nothing important ever seems to happen, but sometimes everything does. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, professional, confirming that all documents had been verified, that the approval had moved forward, and that the closing date was now set. I wrote it down slowly, even though I knew I would not forget it, because writing it made it real, made it something I could not question or second-guess anymore. When the call ended, I stayed there for a few minutes, not celebrating, not reacting, just sitting with the weight of what had just happened, because I understood something clearly. This was not the moment where life suddenly became easy. This was the moment where life became mine to manage completely. I drove home the same way I always did, no music, no distractions, just thinking through the next steps, what needed to be signed, what needed to be transferred, what responsibilities were about to become permanent. When I walked into my apartment, nothing looked different, but everything felt different. The same walls, the same furniture, the same small space. But now it was temporary in a way it had never been before. I gathered the documents I would need for closing, reviewed every page twice, not out of fear, but out of respect for the process, because this was not something I had inherited, not something I had been given. This was something I had built step by step, decision by decision, and I was not going to let a single detail slip through carelessness. The next morning, I went to work like usual, clocked in, moved through the shift, lifted boxes, scanned items, stayed focused, because discipline does not stop. When progress shows up, it becomes more important, not less. People around me talked about the same things: schedules, bills, weekend plans, and I listened without adding much, because I knew I was about to step into something they could not see yet, and explaining it too early would only make it smaller than it actually was later. That week, I noticed my landlord again near the entrance, speaking with someone in a suit, their conversation quiet, controlled, but serious, the kind of tone that comes when numbers are involved, when decisions are being made that affect more than one person. I walked past without slowing down, without looking directly, because I understood now that observation does not require attention, it only requires awareness. The building was moving toward its transition, and I was moving with it. The closing day arrived without noise, without any dramatic shift in the world outside. It was just another weekday morning, traffic, moving people heading to work, life continuing as usual. But for me, it was a line being crossed quietly but permanently. I sat in a small office across from a table where documents were arranged neatly, each page representing a step in the process that had led to this moment. I listened carefully as everything was explained again: terms, conditions, responsibilities, timelines. I signed where I needed to sign, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving through it with clarity, because this was no longer a possibility, it was a commitment. And when the final signature was placed, I did not feel a rush of excitement. I felt something steadier, something more grounded, control, not over everything, but over my direction, over the structure of my life, over the space I had once only occupied. And as I stood up to leave, I understood that the real change was not in the building or the paperwork, it was in the way I saw myself, no longer as someone trying to keep up, but as someone who had learned how to move forward deliberately without needing anyone to notice until the moment it mattered. I walked back into the building that evening the same way I had every day for the past few years, but this time nothing felt routine. The hallway lights still flickered the same way, the paint still peeled near the corners, the air still carried that familiar mix of dust and cleaning chemicals, but the meaning behind it all had changed completely. I was no longer just passing through this space, I was responsible for it, every door, every unit, every detail that I had once complained about quietly in my own head now sat on the other side of my decisions. I did not rush to tell anyone, I did not make announcements or change anything immediately, because I understood something important: ownership is not about showing power, it is About handling responsibility without needing recognition. I spent the first few days reviewing everything again: leases, payment histories, maintenance requests, the condition of each unit. I walked the building slowly, not as a tenant, but as someone seeing it clearly for the first time, noticing what needed attention, what could be improved, what had been ignored for too long. I knocked on a few doors, not to introduce myself as something new, but to listen to simple concerns, heating issues, small repairs, things that had been delayed or overlooked. I took notes carefully because I knew that the way I handled these small things would define everything that came next. I still went to work during the day, still drove deliveries at night, because the transition was not an excuse to stop. It was a reason to stay consistent, to make sure the foundation I had built remained steady while I adjusted to this new role. The difference was not in my schedule, it was in my awareness. Every hour now connected to something larger than just covering my own expenses. It connected to maintaining a system that affected other people who were in the same position I had been in. Not long ago, one evening, I saw my former landlord again, standing near the entrance, looking at the building with a different expression. Not the same confidence, not the same control, just quiet observation, like someone processing a change they did not fully expect. I did not approach him, I did not need to. The situation spoke for itself, and I understood that real change does not require explanation. It becomes clear on its own over time. I continued moving through each day, handling what needed to be handled, organizing repairs, scheduling inspections, making sure payments were structured clearly and fairly, not raising anything unnecessarily, not creating pressure where it was not needed, because I remembered exactly what it felt like to be on the other side of that system, to feel like every decision was made without considering the person living with it. I was not trying to be different for attention, I was simply operating from a place of understanding that had come from experience. The apartment I lived in remained the same for now, the same space, the same setup, but it no longer defined me. It was just one part of a structure I now had the ability to shape over time, and as the days passed, nothing dramatic happened, no sudden recognition, no visible shift from the outside, but inside everything was aligned in a way it had never been before. Every decision, every responsibility, every step forward was connected to something I had built quietly, without shortcuts, without luck, just consistency and awareness, and that was enough. I started seeing the results of small decisions showing up in ways most people would not notice at first. The hallway lights that used to flicker were replaced quietly one afternoon. The heating system that tenants had complained about for months was finally inspected and adjusted, not in a dramatic way, just steady improvements handled without delay, without excuses. I kept everything simple, clear timelines, clear communication, no unnecessary pressure, because I remembered exactly how it felt when things were ignored or delayed without explanation, and I refused to operate that way now that the responsibility was mine. The rent structure stayed consistent, no sudden increases, no hidden fees, just stability, because I understood that people build their lives around predictability, not surprises. I still kept my routine, waking up early, working my warehouse shift, then handling building tasks in the evening, checking maintenance updates, reviewing payments, planning improvements, and at night I still drove deliveries, not because I had to in the same way as before, but because I had trained myself to stay disciplined even when things improved, because progress can disappear quickly if you start assuming it will continue without effort. One evening I sat at my small kitchen table again, the same place where everything had started, but now instead of searching for answers, I was reviewing plans, looking at what could be done next: small upgrades, paint repairs, long-term improvements that would increase the value of the property over time. I ran numbers carefully, not guessing, not hoping, just calculating what made sense and what needed to wait, because timing matters as much as action. I began setting aside funds specifically for maintenance and future upgrades, not touching them for anything else, because I knew that ownership is not just about having something, it is about sustaining it over time. A few tenants started noticing the changes, asking simple questions about repairs being completed faster or about how things seemed more organized. Now I answered calmly, without explaining too much, just letting the work speak for itself, because I understood that trust is built through consistency, not words. I saw my former landlord once more near the edge of the parking lot, speaking briefly with someone, then looking toward the building again, not with frustration, not with anger, just with a kind of quiet acceptance that comes when something has moved beyond your control. I did not feel the need to approach him. I did not feel the need to explain anything, because there was nothing to explain. Everything had already happened, step by step, decision by decision, without shortcuts, without noise, and now it was visible. In a way that did not require discussion, the building was still the same structure on the outside, but inside it had started to shift into something more stable, more intentional, more managed, and I was part of that process in a way I had never been before. I still lived in the same unit, still used the same kitchen, still followed the same routines, but the difference was clear in my mind. I was no longer reacting to circumstances, I was shaping them carefully over time, and that shift changed everything. Without needing to be announced or recognized, I stopped measuring progress by how different things looked and started measuring it by how consistent everything felt. The building ran smoother, not because of big changes, but because of small things being handled on time, repairs scheduled before they became problems, communication clear, without confusion, payments organized without pressure, and I noticed something else. Tenants were calmer, not saying much, but you could feel it in the way they moved through the space. Less frustration, less tension, because when people feel stability, they do not need to talk about it, they just live in it. I continued reviewing numbers every week, tracking expenses, planning improvements, making sure nothing drifted out of control, because I understood something clearly: progress is not something you reach, it is something you maintain, and if you stop paying attention, it slowly disappears without warning. I kept my routines exactly the same, waking up early, working during the day, managing the property in the evenings, keeping my expenses tight even when I could relax them, because discipline is not something you turn on and off, it is something you carry forward. I started setting long-term goals, not large, unrealistic ideas, but structured steps, one improvement at a time, one decision at a time, building something that would last instead of something that looked impressive for a moment. I still saw my former landlord occasionally, never in conversation, just in passing moments near the street or the parking area. His presence quieter now, less certain, not defeated, just removed from something that had once been his, and I understood that perspective more than I expected, because ownership is not permanent, it belongs to whoever is prepared to hold it at the right time, and I had not taken anything from him. I had stepped into a space that opened because I was ready for it. That difference mattered to me because it defined how I would move forward, not with pride, not with comparison, but with responsibility. I spent one evening standing in the hallway after finishing a small repair, looking down the same line of doors I had walked past for years. Nothing looked dramatic, nothing felt different on the surface, but I could see it clearly now. This place had been part of my lowest point, part of a period where I was rebuilding quietly without recognition, and now it had become part of something stable, something structured, something I could shape over time. I walked back into my apartment, sat down at the same table, and looked at the numbers again, not because I needed to check them, but because I respected what they represented. Every dollar saved, every decision made, every moment of discipline had led here, not quickly, not easily, but directly, and as I sat there, I understood something that had taken years to learn. I was never as stuck as I thought I was just unprepared, and once I became prepared, the situation did not need to change all at once. It shifted gradually until one day the position I held was no longer the same, and no one needed to announce it, no one needed to explain it, it was simply clear in the way everything moved forward from that point on.